Barkha, great to have you here in Bombay. We don't get to see you very much.
Great to be here.
You've been an award-winning journalist reporting from the front lines and from the studio for more than 20 years. You have co-founded The Print, a digital news site and live events platform. And of course, you've written your book. Unlike many women, you are unabashedly open about your ambition. What motivates you?
I think what motivates me is what motivates any one of you in this room. The desire to get 101 out of 100. That is the only score that would satisfy me. It makes me a bit of a nightmare to work with because even if something is reasonably good, it doesn't feel good to me if it isn't perfect. And so I think there's a certain streak of crazy perfectionism. I think that drives me. I think what I'm also driven by is how to, I heard the word status quo earlier, and Uday was talking about how to disrupt status quo. I think leadership, since all of you are at leadership levels, I think leadership is all about reinvention and all about not getting too comfortable. I think the death of leadership, the death of creativity is when you think something is too easy. So what motivates me is the pursuit of new challenges, to not get too comfortable, to do better than my best, to not accept a certain level of performance as acceptable and then, to keep pushing the envelope. And as far as not being apologetic about my ambition, I think this is something that women do grapple with. I think men are applauded and they are feted for their ambition and for their drive, and I think women are still made to feel defensive about it. And I think at some point I decided long ago that ambition is a plus. It's a plus in a man, it's a plus in a woman, and it should be celebrated and encouraged in both.
Now, Barkha, we all know that India is a paradox.
Yeah.
We have women who have achieved great heights in all sorts of fields: media, the law, business, finance. We have female chief ministers, we have women leading political parties, and yet discrimination is rampant. Whether it's in the office, where if a woman wears her ambition on her sleeve, or of course, as we know outside, whether it's sexual, physical discrimination, all the rest of it. How do you explain this paradox?
It's a very interesting paradox. Both of us were recently in New York, and where, as you know, the big focus is on whether America is finally going to have its first woman president. And to those of us who sort of, were born in the 70s and, grew up in the sort of, watched Indira Gandhi. I was in school when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, but we never sort of even reflected on the fact that we had a woman prime minister. Like, there was nothing to think about. In our neighborhood in Pakistan, you've had women, you've had Benazir Bhutto. So it's very peculiar for us to go from South Asia into this so-called more progressive society, which is still unable to break the glass ceiling. And I remember Hillary Clinton once told me that, even now, when she goes to a public function, she said, they never use the language for me that they do for Barack Obama. And when they talk about me, it's always Hillary Clinton, parenthesis, wearing a blue pantsuit, right? But they never talk about Obama's suit. They never talk about Obama's hair or lack of hair. They're always talking about, or his style. Yeah. And so she was offering that up as a small example of, the little discriminations that she has to face in a political culture that is male, essentially male. Now, we're a really paradoxical society because we have women leading states. We have women leading channels, we have women leading companies, but I would still argue that this is a superficially empowered space, because if you actually deep dive into it, there are very few women, certainly all the women in this room, we're all protected by our class, we're protected by our education, we're protected. We are protected, we are privileged women. But for millions of other women, these are only dreams to aspire to. The other thing that I want to talk about is what happens to women when they come into essentially male cultures, whether it's media, whether it's business, the corporate space, or whether it's politics. Because these are essentially male spaces, Gayatri, I think women feel a great deal of pressure to not be tagged as women. I know that for years I just hated being called a woman journalist. I know a number of CEOs who just hate being called a woman CEO, right? They just want to be measured. You don't want any concessions. I certainly don't. I don't want concessions. I don't want to be measured in a different way. I definitely believe that I can compete with men in my profession, without gender being a factor. But in politics, it's really peculiar that, for example, all of you have heard of the Nirbhaya gang rape, right? Which became such a big moment when young men and women were out protesting on the street. This is that infamous Delhi gang rape 3 years ago. But at that time, we had women in some of the most powerful political positions. Sonia Gandhi was leading the Congress. Delhi had a woman chief minister. You had any number of women in positions of power. But do you think that the women politicians were more sensitive on the issue than the men? I would say no. There was absolutely no difference in the response of the female politicians when compared to the male politicians, which makes me wonder whether women assimilate maleness in essentially male cultures, and where is that balance between not wanting special treatment but then denying your gender to that degree where you're almost invisible as female. And this is a battle that all of us fight.
Well, I think in New York you talked about this, about the fact that women are not immune to the misogyny and the patriarchy that is, sort of imbued in our culture.
We're not, but we also want to prove ourselves much more than men. I feel that women are under a kind of pressure to prove themselves in a way that I don't know if the men in this room would agree. I'd be really curious to hear from you when we take questions. But I don't know if you face the same pressure to prove yourself. I don't know if you're scrutinized in the same way, if you're talked about in the same way. I don't know how you feel about women in in your workspace. But I know that a lot of women spend a lot of energy saying, I am here to compete with you on equal terms, on a level playing field. I don't want favors, I don't want concessions, but I don't want discrimination either. I just want that level playing field on which, after that, measure us on our talent.
I'm going to jump around a bit and then come back. But, Indra Nooyi said this as well. She said that women don't help other women she was talking specifically in the corporate space, and she gave the example of, a man who was giving a presentation and it was going terribly wrong, and then they took a restroom break, and all the other guys told him in the restroom that, you have to fix yourself, fix the presentation, it's going really badly. But in a similar situation, she said she never had an experience where she got that kind of feedback from her female colleagues. Have you experienced something like that in your own?
I would not make it, I don't know that it's true that men help men and women don't help women. I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that women face more pressure to prove themselves, and therefore there is greater, I don't want to use the word insecurity, but there's a greater gap between what you want to do and where you are, what you want to achieve and where you want to get. And maybe therefore women who are successful are possibly more competitive than their male counterparts. It's an interesting thing, but I think you're constantly on this treadmill and you're worried that if you get complacent for even a moment, there's going to be somebody who's going to be coming to push you off. So you never quite stop being competitive. I mean, I would say that I remain fiercely competitive. I think I'm fiercely competitive. And I think that my profession requires me to be fiercely competitive. But I don't think that has to do with my not helping another woman. I mean, I may not want to help the competition, whether it's a man or a woman.
Fair enough. You brought up Nirbhaya, the horrific 2012 gang rape that took place in Delhi. And that sort of was a harbinger of a gender Arab Spring for India. 4 years later, where do you think we are on this conversation?
I think one thing that has changed is that gender is no longer a marginal conversation. It's no longer a conversation that only women have. I think diversity at the workplace is now something that all corporates, all workspaces, the media, companies like this, Parliament are having to confront. So I think the biggest change is that we're finally seeing gender at the heart of our public debate. But I think we have a long way to go. I think when women outside of cities, outside of realities that we know, get raped or abused, it doesn't make it to our headlines. We, in any case, inhabit a kind of parallel universe. India has multiple realities. I think those women remain invisible. I think gender is not an electoral issue. You can't actually win or lose elections on the basis of what women think. Which is interesting because in the United States of America, you're seeing something very different happen. I mean, Donald Trump has actually converted women into an en masse vote bloc. The one thing we do know is that women will not vote for Donald Trump. And therefore, a lot of people are saying Donald Trump is Hillary Clinton's dream come true, because you know that women will consolidate behind Hillary if it comes down to a Hillary versus Trump battle. I don't see any parallel like that here. You do not actually see women being able to influence elections as women, you know, so as individuals,
or
of
mobilize
course,
en masse.
or mobilize. So it is not, and I think till it becomes electorally relevant, we will continue to battle in a way that, you know, that where the gaps between what we want to achieve and where we are will remain very, very big.
Well, let's talk about women in the workplace, since we are in a corporate setting, which you have written about in the first chapter of your book as well. India has seen a declining trend in female participation in the workforce. According to the ILO, it's gone from 35% to 25% from 2004 to 2011. Moreover, 48% of working women in India drop out by the time they reach mid-career.
Yeah.
48%. The comparable stat in Asia is 29%. We know that keeping women in the workforce could add 2 percentage points to our GDP. Why is this great female flame out happening?
You know, this is the most worrying statistic, that I think it's the most untold story in India, because when you look around today, women occupy the headlines like never before, and you get this impression that the glass ceiling is broken. But what's actually happening is, as Gayatri said, this massive decline. There's actually a decline. We're not even at the same level. There are fewer women working today, you know, as a percentage of the population than there were 20 years ago. This number is consistently declining. I think world over conversations that corporates are having with themselves is, how do we keep women in the workforce? How do we create an environment that is in fact conducive for women to stay on? And here I'm going to say something controversial. I think we put too much onus on the workspace to keep women in the workspace. I think the reason women do not stay in the workspace is because they don't have equality at home. And we suddenly make corporates accountable for why women don't stay on in their jobs. I actually think you have to make the home space accountable for why women don't stay, because mostly women will drop out typically after they're married or they become parents, right? And because there isn't a 50% sharing of the household jobs at home, women are not able to balance work and home. And yet we're making corporates accountable for this. And I have to tell you that as a woman who gives her 100% to work and who's available on her phone 24/7, because that's the kind of job I'm in, I'm deeply disturbed that women have this expectation that they want to compete on what we call the level playing field, but they somehow want a flexibility that their male counterparts don't have. I have a problem with that. I know it's politically incorrect. I know the politically correct thing to say is that, you know, women, flexi hours for women. Well, if we're going to have flexi hours for women, we must have them for men. One of the great things that's happened, which, you know, recently in New York, and Melinda Gates has spoken about this, is that her foundation actually offers gender neutral family leave. So it's called family leave instead of maternity leave. Which means that a man and a woman, if you've just become a parent, can actually get exactly the same time off. And I think this is actually fantastic, because when we talk about creches, we talk only in terms of female workers. When we talk about flexi hours, we talk only in terms of female workers. But if we want men to be co-parents, if we want men to do 50%, we have to offer them the same 50% flexibility in the workspace. So we need to tell men in the workspace that your female peer will not get concessions that you're not entitled to. That's not fair. We can't say we've made it up on our own merits if we want special concessions at the workspace. Whatever special concessions, if work environments are meant to be more family friendly or work-life balance oriented, they have to be the same for the men. And I'm hugely frustrated when I invest so much energy in training women. They're fantastic colleagues, and then suddenly you see a dip in ambition after they get married. And you're like, okay, that's partly your responsibility, but it's partly also the responsibility of what happens at the workspace. And one of the ways, I beg your pardon, the home space, and one of the ways to even this out is for corporations to say, yes, we will encourage people to do well at work and also have a personal life, but we will encourage both men and women to do that.
I think you just became the poster child for corporate India when it comes to work-life balance.
Well, I actually have no work-life balance, and nor do I believe in it. It's a terrible thing to say, and everybody's going to beat me up. People get very annoyed with me when I say it. But I actually think this is some new age fad. I don't know what it means. I mean, I just feel like you have to give whatever you're doing 100%. And you can't have a shift-oriented approach to being a leader, especially to being a leader. If you want to lead, you have to lead by example. You have to lead from the front. And that has to mean that you have to work harder than anybody in your team.
Well, Barkha, you've also written in your book about the great conundrum that is India, which is as income and education levels of men rise, the women they are married to show a greater inclination to stop working. In fact, this is why urban Indian women are less likely to work than those in rural India. How do we address this issue of the kind of, the status of sort of, not working?
It's so unfortunate that instead of taking pride in work, right, and instead of seeking purpose in work, and I think that work has to be about so much more than earning a livelihood. Work actually has to, in so many ways, I believe should define the purpose of who you are. How you define yourself can be in many, many ways. You could, you could work at an NGO, you could work to teach at a school, you could work at Godrej. But there has to be a purpose in your life that is beyond you. There has to be something that's beyond you. And unfortunately in India with economic mobility, we're actually seeing the opposite. We're looking at work, and we're even looking at education for women especially as some kind of investment in the marriage market instead of in the workspace, right? So as people get more money, they actually derive some sort of strange pride in saying, okay, my wife doesn't work, or because she doesn't need to. But guess what? Women are not working only because, yes, that's one of the factors, but you're not working only because you need the money. You're also working because it gives you a sense of purpose, because it gives you a sense of identity, because you define yourself against what you do. So this is a very, very unfortunate status symbolism to rising incomes that, women don't need to work. Women don't work because they need to work. Women work because they want to work, just like men.
Let's talk about time management, something I'm sure everyone in this room will relate to. You have a daily news show.
Yes.
You write a weekly column.
Yes.
You are deep in the rough and tumble of everyday news reporting. How did you find the time to write this nuanced, unbiased narrative of contemporary India?
I did not sleep for a year and a half. I actually did not sleep because I didn't stop working, and I would come back home from doing my daily show at about 10:30 at night, and then maybe rest for an hour, hour and a half, and then write all night. I would write from midnight to 5 in the morning. That is how I wrote the book.
And I must say, it is a very nuanced book. I mean, you really did take the time.
Nuance was really important to me because I am so sick to death of certain television channels, and you all know who I mean in this room. No prizes for guessing who. Just killing the art of conversation, making television into this shouting match, who screams loudest, who has the most reductionist, least nuanced narrative. This populism of television, where complexity has been thrown out of the window, where binaries, if you support this, then you're anti this. It's all gone. Like, for example, I don't know what you guys think, but like this IPL and drought conversation, right? People are so guilty. People feel so guilty and apologetic today if they want to say, but, are the two linked? And yet, if you actually break it down, growing sugarcane consumes much more water than actually watering the pitch. And so the problem is water guzzling crops like sugarcane. And guess what? A lot of politicians in Maharashtra are sugarcane farmers. So nobody wants to talk about all this, right? It's too complicated a thought. It's just much easier to say that these rich, vulgar people have actually caused the drought because that sounds better, right? So I'm giving it to you as an example of the frustration that we're facing. It's an inflection point in journalism where television has become theatre, and television has become entertainment, and television news has become that. And it was really important for me to step back from all of it and say, you know what, I can have a complex conversation. I was born with more brains than taking for and against sides in a television studio. And this book is really about that for me.
Now, in your book, you also took a very brave and bold stance about personal, things that have happened to you, about your own abuse as a child and then later as an adult. And, Uday Kotak talked about the future digitization, all that. We know the kind of blowback that is now taking place on social media from trolling. Really vicious, awful, misogynist comments that men, it's almost always men, feel they can make because it's the anonymity of the internet. Did you pause? Were you at all concerned about sort of putting that out there into the world?
So when I was writing my book, my first chapter, so the book has 7 different chapters, and it goes from everything from politics to India-Pakistan to war to why we can't agree on what secularism is, to all kinds of, many different subjects. But the first chapter is called The Place of Women in India, and I explore some of these contradictions and my own experiences. And I did put in a very personal experience about child sexual abuse, which I experienced personally when I was not even 10 years old. And why did I put this in? I'm asked, why did I put this in? And you know what? It's not an easy answer. And I hesitated to put it in, Gayatri, not because of the fear of blowback, but because the book was not an autobiography. The book was a book about India. And I didn't want to become the story. I was telling a story. The only reason I did put it in eventually is because my chapter dealt with why so many women find it difficult to speak and how there's a conspiracy of silence that surrounds these kind of issues. And I felt that if I was going to remain silent, then I was reconfirming what happens to other women. And therefore, to be intellectually and emotionally honest in my writing, I felt I had to first break that silence. Now, since then, there are a lot of people who've come out and said, in complete solidarity, and it hasn't been all terrible and ugly. But yes, in the world of social media, there are people who've said, oh, she's making it up. Oh, she's lying. Oh, she did it for publicity. I mean, I'm on TV every day. I don't need publicity, right? I've been on TV for 20 years of my life. So it's ridiculous, the things you hear, right? But it's educative because it shows why so many women don't speak. It shows what happens to women when they speak. But trolling is something that goes beyond women. Trolling, I don't know, how many of you are active on Twitter or Facebook? Just raise your hand if you're active. So you've seen the kind of filth, men and women, like utter crap that's actually said, masquerading as an argument. What is trolling? Trolling to me is what used to be bullying when you went to boarding school. Trolling is that on Twitter. It is somebody trying to intimidate you by mocking you, by making fun of you, by making you or trying to make you feel stupid. And what do they want? They want to scare you into silence and they want to feel power. Except here, most of them are anonymous. They don't have the guts to even reveal their own name. It's actually the online version of mob lynching. They want to come after you in hordes and they want to intimidate. It's a mind game. They want to make you scared. And I just find that because I can see that that's what they want to do, I'm just damned if I'm going to let anybody tell me what I should think. It's a free country. I'm allowed to think what I want to. I'm allowed to say what I want to as long as I don't trample on anybody's faith or sensibilities. You all follow a sort of a basic code of decency. But we're here to talk about leadership. What is leadership? One of the things people often talk about leadership in terms of, and success in terms of popularity. I've always said that leadership is actually about the willingness to be and the capacity to be unpopular. To sometimes take a position that won't win you the mass response, but it's what you believe. And leadership is about the power of one. I was very interested in listening to Uday about team versus individual. Yes, individuals have to be team players, but individuals first have to be individuals. And I do believe it's important for companies, for all workplaces, to find what every individual is good at and not put everybody into the same sort of box because everybody is different. And how do you create spaces that celebrate individualism? And as we, as we try and be individuals first and then something else, there will be pushback. There will be people who will tell you, oh no, you should think this. Why do you think this? Why do you say this? Why do you eat this? Why do you like this movie? Why do you like this political party? Whatever. Why do you like Virat Kohli? Why do you like whatever? I mean, everybody likes Virat Kohli right now, but I didn't like the fact that people made jokes about Anushka Sharma when they were talking about Virat Kohli's either success or failure. But if you say that on Twitter today, you'll have some 100 people coming after you, but you've got to stand your ground. And to take on the trolls is to stand your ground. It's just one more version of standing your ground.